Hi, it appears that we're live, so I'm going to start this session. Good afternoon. Welcome to our Transport Planning Society's webinar on parking policy. We've called it Just a Ticket, and Just a Ticket is also the title of the TPS report that was mainly written by Andrew Potter, who's with us today, which contains 18 recommendations on how to use parking policy better to encourage behavior change towards lower carbon travel. The report is posted on the TPS website, and you can also find there two accompanying documents. One is an easy to read summary of our key recommendations, and the other is an infographic that projects on an imaginary city how each of our recommendations could be implemented. As I said, visit our website to find these three documents. As the Transport Planning Society, we are really, really keen to see our policy outputs used more in practice. Speaking about TPS, we are the only professional body in the country focusing entirely on transport planning. We've got about 1,500 members. We aim to facilitate, develop, and promote best practice in transport planning and provide a focus for dialogue between all those engaged within it, whatever their background or professional affiliation. My name is Tom Van Duren. I'm currently TPS Policy Director. My main employer is Amy, where I am a strategic business partner, and I'm also a visiting professor at the University of Leeds. My main claim to transport planning fame is, however, that I write every month a short article in my local village newsletter about pothole of the month, and in which I don't just take a photo of another crater in Herefordshire's road, but also post interesting facts about traffic and transport. And my article on induced demand was particularly liked by my readers. Now, I really wanted to produce this policy document on parking. Like my old friend Glenn Lyons, I am incredibly frustrated by the lack of progress in the Department for Transport's consultation on pavement parking, which closed in November 2020 and should have had summary of responses published within 3 months, which is obviously now 3 years ago. I don't think for a moment that this publication and this seminar will speed up the process, but there are many other ways in which we can use parking policy to achieve a less car-centric society. And I think that would benefit everyone. And that's what today is all about. We're running our webinars in a slightly different format this year. So instead of 3 or sometimes even 4 speakers, we only have 2. This should allow, first of all, every speaker to do justice to their subject. And secondly, it also should allow you as participants plenty of time for questions and answers and general debate on parking and the policy of parking controls. We will try to catch your questions in the chat function. So please drop them in there. I've allocated 90 minutes in total, but given that we're all busy people, I will aim to finish after about 60 to 75 minutes, but let's see how this pans out. Okay, our speakers. Our first speaker is Andrew Potter. He's the MD of Parking Perspectives, which is a consultancy that, as the name suggests, specializes in parking-related advice. Andrew used to be a transport modeler, but his attention these days is focused on generating parking demand forecasts and providing car park estate planning advice to local authorities and governments. Things that he focuses on is post-COVID working, changes in population, internet shopping, demands for bigger parking spaces, and an increasing concern about fire in older structures and the potential impacts that AVs may have on how and where we park. Our second speaker is Alice Roberts, who is head of campaigns at CPRE London. CPRE used to be known as the Campaign to Protect Rural England, but now prefers to be known as the Countryside Charity. Alice chairs the London Healthy Streets Scorecard Coalition, and she campaigns on green space protection, in particular as it relates to environment, planning, housing, and transport issues. Alice has led work in London to raise the profile of parking policy as one of the most important important and cost-effective levers available to local authorities to tackle a range of social and environmental issues. Both speakers have about 15 minutes, maybe runs out a little bit later, and then I will lead the discussion with both of them based on your questions and comments. So, Andrew, over to you.
Right, Tom, thank you. Hopefully everyone can hear me, and I'm just going to share the screen. So, in the minutes I have, I'm going to run you through the document that we produced. It's taken about 2 years. I'd like to say it's been a labour of love. It's been a labour of something, certainly. Now, let's move this on. What spurned it was that the Transport Planning Society created in 2020 the State of the Nation document. And the key element of that document was that if current travel patterns continued, then there was no significant change to creating a sustainable future. People needed to drive less. And that call to our action really has been behind just the ticket document around parking. The reason parking is such a good policy lever is that much of what is needed from parking is already in place. The regulations, the parking pricing, the collection of fees, the enforcement, the debt recovery, penalty charge notices, and critically, public acceptance that there is rules and regulations and charges associated with parking are already in place. And parking affects most people across the country one way or another. Generally, certainly parking in public locations has an impact on most people who drive. It makes it a really easy tool rather than, for example, creating road user charging or something like that. Honourable as they may be, but the fact is they are something that we don't yet have in place in a same sort of ubiquitous way as we do with parking. The other thing about the document is there's 18 recommendations. The plan is for it to hopefully influence government and others. It's written with a view that we're here to transition people, not suddenly come with a cliff edge change in the way people live and drive. That probably is unworkable. We recognize that there is a need for people to migrate and get out of maybe 40 or 50 years of land use planning that has created car dependency. The recommendations are set out under 3 main headings. What we need from our planning laws is really reiterating what many local authorities are already doing. It's around maximums and minimums with parking standards, maximums for many locations that have already got good access to other means of travel, minimums for other modes other than cars. And that is in there because it was felt there's a need to reiterate what local authorities are often already doing and what policy was already in place, because there is a vulnerability and potential weakness that if we didn't reiterate that, those in positions of influence and power might consider them to be unimportant. So we've included a number of things in there just to carry on. They're good and they need to be done and used more. Making the use of space more equitable is really driven around trying to change public attitudes as to whose responsibility it is for parking people's own private cars. Fundamentally, this whole section is looking at the misappropriation of public space for private use, i.e. parking private cars in public areas when it seemed that there isn't enough parking provided, and therefore it is a responsibility placed upon society or the local community or the local authority to provide that parking because somebody owns a car which is their own private vehicle. And that whole element pervades through the section around making parking space or making the use of space more equitable, to actually start raising the question as to, should we be using that space for parking for people to park their private vehicles when in fact that space could be used for other things? And Alice is going to, I'm not going to dwell on this because Alice is going to pick up on lots of these issues. And the third section, we talk about environmental taxes and charges. And fundamentally, this is about some policy ideas around how we redress the situation whereby the polluter or the beneficiary, the people driving, start to pay a little bit more through the mechanisms we have in place already and through other ideas, therefore to finance or make more attractive other modes of travel, and effectively make the attractiveness gap between shall I drive or shall I take some other mode of travel a lot closer, and ideally even better, to the point whereby I don't think I'll drive anymore. It's become a little bit too difficult or a little bit too expensive for this particular journey. So I'm going to take the bus, or I'm going to walk or cycle. So what we have is our imaginary town, and this is a big test as to whether the technology will do what it should. I'm just going to pick out 2 or 3 of the recommendations that are probably worth sharing as something that could be seen to be a little bit different or worthy of debate at the end of the session. So the first one that we've talked about is around parking. Oh, it's done it again. Let's see. Looks like we might be stuck in a continuous time loop here. Here we are. It's worked now. So we certainly support the use of maximum car parking standards for new developments as a way of reducing car ownership over the long term. And with that, there needs to be on-street controls and other methods to stop people just acquiring cars and then just dumping the problem on the rest of the community or society. All that's embodied within the recommendations. But it's also recognizing that many people have more than one car per household. We certainly don't want to build that parking into the development by saying, well, people currently have more cars, so let's not design this as the way we want it. Let's just allow them to have 3 or 4 parking spaces, because then they're there forever. And we can never break the cycle of saying, well, you've got less parking, so own less vehicles. So instead, we're proposing something that we call parking supply bridging, which is effectively within the developments, allocating space that for a period of time will remain owned by the local authority and will provide parking for those extra vehicles that people have to have at the moment because of their lifestyles and because of the way they need to get to work and all the rest of it. But over time, and ideally with a set timescale, that piece of land and that facility will become removed. But because it's owned by the local authority, they control that and they can take it away at some point in the future. Moving on, oh yeah, it's working, seems to be. One of the other things we've looked at is a situation, and this has worsened since COVID, is that there are a number of towns and cities where there is actually more parking than is probably needed. And we have instances in many towns and cities across the UK where multi-storey car parks that are owned by third parties have moved to a situation of trying to ensure they get the best commercial return from the location. They'll offer early bird, low-cost deals for people parking in before the peak hour or during the peak, and people staying there all day. This makes commercial sense. If you're carrying 200 spare spaces, why not fill it up at £5 a time rather than just leaving it empty? And the whole idea of the early bird is that you don't actually diminish your more lucrative short stay, higher turnover market during the day, which can carry on charging it £1.50, £2 an hour or whatever it may be. The problem with the early bird is that it's actually undermining many of the measures that local authorities may be doing to increase the cost of long stay parking, increase the cost of parking for those who are traveling in peak periods. And certainly if you're trying to run a park and ride and you've got 1 or 2 of these car parks offering these very low discount rates, your park and ride is very much being undermined to the point whereby people are just going to say, well, I'm going to drive in. Why will I pay £3 to ride the bus when I can pay £5 and park all day right near my office? So our proposal is to introduce or to encourage local authorities to look at a piece of legislation that has been around nearly 40 years and which allows them to license an area, and all third parties within that area are subject to the license, and must comply with the rules, which could include things such as being told what pricing regime, what minimum pricing they have to operate. And it could apply to a town centre or a city centre by the highway authority. That way, things like the early bird could be licensed out and not permitted. And moving across here then to our next area of town, we include in there a couple of recommendations about things such as verge parking, pavement parking, how the use of cars and their parking can be very detrimental to the heritage, and measures to try and enforce or elevate the responsibility of highway authorities to prevent the misappropriation of public space where people progressively acquire cars and then start parking them in public areas, get away with it. It's not dealt with, and it's to the detriment of the amenity and to other members of the public, including and quite particularly pavement parking. And the other thing I want to mention is utility pricing, which is a concept of understanding where the benefit and the costs come when somebody parks. So when somebody drives into a town centre, for example, or a city centre, the reason they drive is because they enjoy the comfort and the speed, primarily the speed and the utility, if you like, of being able to drive their car into the town centre and park it close to where they want to be. And when they leave that town centre, they also gain and enjoy the benefits that their personal car offers them. While the car is parked, they're not really deriving huge benefit. That's not what the parking does. The parking enables them to drive, and that's the bit that they derive the benefit or the utility from. When we look at the cost to society, while that car is parked with the engine off, it's not really having a lot of damage to anyone, certainly not hurting the environment, not in a marginal sense. And it's really actually when the car's being driven into the town centre and out that the costs are incurred. Adds to congestion, creates risk to vulnerable road users, potentially causes severance, noise, pollutants, these sorts of things. So what utility pricing is suggesting is that we stop charging for duration of stay, which I know has been the mainstream way and the accepted way for years. But actually that isn't where the benefits or the costs come. We start charging based on the time that somebody arrives at a car park and the time they leave as a proxy for actually the costs that they're imposing on society. As long as that car park isn't full, if the car park becomes full, then the duration of stay has a cost because actually it prevents somebody else from parking there, and that's a disutility to society. But if a car park isn't full, then there's argument for saying duration is irrelevant. And we should ladle all the costs onto the time of entry. So if they come in the peak hour, we effectively create a proxy congestion charge because they've driven in. If they drive out in the peak evening, again, the charge will be there. And if they drive during the middle of the day and they've come into a town centre, by accessing during the middle of the day, perhaps there's a severance charge that we apply, because if they come in between 10 and 4 p.m., that action means that the street is less pedestrian friendly and people can't move around in the shopping area they might wish to. And that, I'm going to move away from there, is, oh, here we go. We're finally flying out. So as Tom mentioned, these two graphics are summarized on the TPS website. We've got them on our website as well. And the 18 recommendations are listed out there in little call out boxes for a quick, easy read, hopefully. My last slide, what's next? Well, the plan is that this document can be submitted to key decision makers to try and influence and perhaps change some fundamental thinking, and helping the position TPS take to decarbonise transport in the UK. We'd also like it to stimulate debate, and we'd also be very interested if there's any authorities who are doing these things or planning to do them or have done very similar things that would be of great value to add to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Andrew. And that was an impressive use of that infographic that you created for us as well. I enjoyed that a lot. Alice, can I hand over the microphone to you?
Hi, thanks everybody. So yeah, I'm Alice Roberts. I'm from CPRE London and also chair the London Healthy Street Scorecard, as Tom said. And so I just want to talk briefly to start with about why we talk about parking a lot. But just to say, to start with that, that the reason I'm here today is because we've done a lot of work around parking policy, which relates obviously mainly to London, but does have use for any authority, local authority in the country. And I suppose that while Andrew comes at this from a particular perspective, we come at it from a slightly different perspective, which is all about sustainable transport, and for us particularly spatial issues. So so we talk about a lot of the same things, but some from a slightly different angle, I suppose. This is a picture of outside my house in London. I've got a parklet, so just some flower beds in the road, which Hackney Council allowed me to do about 5 years ago. So the parking action tool is where you can find the benchmark policy that we've created, and you can look through everything that I talk about today, or most of what I talk about today. This presentation is online, and I think it will be put in the chat where I keep it, so you can come back to it. It's quite long, so I'm just going to go through certain slides more quickly than others, and you can always come back to it. The intention is for anybody to come back to, but also go to the parking action tool, where you can which is intended as a way to kind of assess local authority parking policy against a benchmark, which probably is is an ambitious benchmark deliberately. So these are the contents. I'm not going to go through all of them. This is just so that when and if you come back to it, you can navigate through it quickly. So I've added in this bit recently. This was just to make a bit clearer why the Countryside Charity might be talking about parking. So I just thought, since Andrew told me he came from Chelmsford, hails from Chelmsford, I thought, well, I'll look at Chelmsford, shall I? And I looked at it. It was really interesting because I thought, well, that's a town that is quite small. It should be, to an extent, walkable, cyclable, and certainly should be easy to navigate with public transport. Yet there's quite a lot of space in the middle, which is given to car parking, which of course promotes car parking, but also is space which could be used for other things. At the same time, you have this development, and very interestingly, Google Satellite View shows the land before it was developed like this. So you can see all the street layouts, but this is right on the edge of Chelmsford. And so you can see that before the development, this was all productive land, farmland mainly by the look of it. This is what it is now. So instead of the bridging areas that Andrew was talking about, you've got houses which are essentially car dependent, where a lot of space has been given to car parking. And in fact, they even had garages, which I was really interested to see. So yeah, if that doesn't make clear the links between countryside loss and parking, I don't know what does, but obviously, come back to me if you need more. So why does parking matter? There's so many reasons. Primarily, it's about promoting mode shift and also healthier travel choices, but it's also a lot to do with the amount of space that we give to parking. So it's really about those spatial issues that we care about. There are other issues, obviously, like road casualties and safety, about our urban realm, even about economic recovery, about the countryside, which I've just mentioned, and also something that Andrew mentioned, which is about delivering fair use of public space, in particular in areas like in inner London, where something like 2/3 of households don't have access to a car. And indeed, the vast majority of trips are not made by car, and yet so much space is taken up by private car parking. So those two slides just kind of repeat what I've said just there. So time for change. This is really just about saying that, as Andrew mentioned, it's one of the most effective tools local authorities can use. But actually, what we don't see huge ambition in using parking policy to tackle serious issues like, for instance, climate change or air pollution. So that's why we kind of started to think about creating this benchmark. This is a graph that I used to show the kind of variability within London of ambitions around parking policy. The light blue coloured ones are inner London and dark blue outer London. So this is the proportion of space which is controlled for parking in the borough. So you can see there are a number of authorities which control all of their streets now. But if you look down there, Lewisham, which is an inner London borough, only 20% of its streets have controlled parking. So that's a kind of, fundamental number one issue. Are you controlling parking? If you're not, you're effectively enabling car journey mode shift. So local authorities have probably more powers than most people think around parking. So obviously it's the local highway and local traffic authority. They're managers of housing estates often, not always, but often. They can own or operate public car parks. They are the local planning authority, the transport authority, and they may well, of course, be an employer with workplace parking too. So there are lots of ways that they can influence parking. We talked a bit about land use planning, and actually it's interesting that Andrew talked about bridging, because I haven't put that in this presentation yet, but I'm going to add it in. I'm always adding things into this presentation, but the most important thing is that planning documents, local plans, are underpinned by sustainable transport plan. Housing needs to be planned at appropriate density, so that we know that, for instance, you can't support a bus service financially unless you're building at around 100 dwellings per hectare and not below 60. The parking standards, again, Andrew mentioned that, in London we have a starting point of car-free development, but I don't think there are any other boroughs or councils or planning authorities in the country which have adopted that. And of course, we need to be looking at redeveloping surface car parks and preferably even multi-story car parks at some point. So yeah, parking's at the heart of land use planning. And I think it basically is summarised by, if you plan for cars, you get cars. So we're, on the side of the compact city with Greenbelt, and what we don't want is urban sprawl, and that's why we talk about car parking. So this is my great example, Stevenage. Those are surface car parks in Stevenage. The inset picture is Stevenage, which looks to be roughly the size of Chelmsford, actually. It's eminently walkable, cyclable, and public transportable, if you like, and it has built-in cycling infrastructure, and yet the town centre is just one big surface car park. So the orange squares there are surface car parking. So we're just kind of perpetuating unsustainable patterns of development. This is a slide about density. I'm just going to skip through this. These are some pictures of surface car parks in London. One which was going to be developed, that's fallen through now. This is the example of parking standards in the London plan, so that you can refer to that. This is about the parking hierarchy. I'm going to skip through this bit, and parking audits and charges. So we do talk a lot about charges, but I didn't want to talk about that too much today. Reports and finances. Obviously, councils have to, so that you can look through some of them, for instance, Hackney's, and see that they support. Oh, I hope I haven't frozen my. Okay, hopefully. So that they support concessionary fares, for example, in Hackney. and parking charges are very important. You are allowed to use funding from parking to fund other forms of transport action, sustainable transport action. That's really important, and I kind of feel like that's a trick that many councils are missing. So that sets out the powers. And this section talks about controlled parking zones, which I'm not going to talk about a great deal, but that's some pictures of what happens before and after controlled parking has been introduced. So in this one, it's actually a housing estate, but this was being used for commuter parking, and when they put in controlled parking, just disappeared. This is a housing estate where there is no controlled parking, and this just shows how space gets appropriated for parking, essentially. And that, again, is something that I think Andrew's picture showed, but this is a kind of real life picture where pavements get taken over and so forth. Obviously, we don't support pavement parking. That should be got rid of immediately everywhere. This is a really good example. Accessibility. So one of the things that we talk about is pavements and keeping pavements clear, but there are other reasons why parking is obviously very important to accessibility. And one is about pavement crossovers. One is about keeping pavements clear, but another one is about how, sorry, it's not on this page, but it's about how there should be gaps in parking approximately every 100 meters. But that's very rarely adhered to, so that people in a wheelchair or even somebody with a buggy can cross the road safely without having to go the whole distance of the road if there is parking the whole way along the road. So we talk a lot about front garden parking and private land as well. So front garden parking causes all kinds of problems for the environment, but they also cause problems for pavements, and increasingly are causing overhanging onto pavements with bigger cars. So we've got a lot of stuff in here about tackling front garden parking problems. This is a picture of where you see forecourt parking in front of shops, which again has its own issues, which ideally would be got under better control. Kind of take over space, and then it ends up being used for workplace parking without really any kind of actual agreement or policy to do so. So we kind of say, well, you know, if you're in an inner London borough like this is in Hackney, that's where I come from, so lots of my pictures are from Hackney, that, you know, as an authority, you should be, you know, trying to keep that under control. There's a lot of reasons why parking links to improving the public realm, but also supporting the local economy. So there's a whole section here on that. So this is an example just of a street. So improving the street scene by removing a certain amount of parking and putting in some trees. That's a before and after. This is a historic setting, Somerset House, before it was a car park, and now it's obviously a really lovely public space. The pedestrian pound, Living Streets pedestrian pound, obviously deals with how making spaces, you know, prioritised for pedestrians actually can help improve local economies and footfall for local shops. Often it's felt that removing parking will kill off businesses, and but there's a lot of, most of the evidence points in the other direction, and which is that if you make a space nice for pedestrians, and yeah, that actually helps local businesses. So this is another way to help local business, which is that you can, you know, give them a bit of space that they can rent effectively on the curbside. And here's a link to some town centre before and afters, which you can peruse at your own time. And then just quickly about safety. I'm going to go over time a minute, so I'm going to skip through this quickly. So that's an example of how parking was removed from one side of a street to make it safer, and you can see that there was even a school there. Keeping pavements clear. There's such a massive link between pavements and parking. So what we say is, all this stuff that usually gets dumped on a pavement, including trees, but we don't say that you should chop trees down, but you can build around them. So the picture on the right shows how that's being done in one street. But if you want to put in new trees, they should be on build outs in the road, or they can be in a rain garden or a sustainable urban drainage system. So this shows how even parking signs get dumped on the pavement, and they create a obstruction for pedestrians. So I just took that little picture there for the parking permit resident holder that was used for this seminar, as it's on this fence and not on a post discreetly to the right, to try to stop an obstruction on the pavement. Electric vehicle charging points should not be on the pavement. They should be taking space from car parking. Bins can be put in the road, not taking space from pedestrians. And you can also create parklets. You can put rain gardens where there used to be parking. You can take an entire street and turn it into a park. You can put cycle hangers, obviously. You can create space for dockless cycle parking so that they're not left all over the pavement. And you can even create a cycle lane, as in this before and after picture. Bus lanes. This is not a before and after, but it's two streets, one where parking has been removed to create a bus lane, and one which has two very busy bus routes in central London, but still has no bus lanes and has parking. And you can create space for car share. So that's an example of Lambeth's curbside strategy, which links to parking, obviously, if anybody wants to look at it. And of course, it's not just about parking, it's also about all kinds of other things. But today we're focusing on parking. And so, yeah, that's it. Parking is key. There's time for change is now. Councils can do things right now. And that's it. So I'm sorry I skipped through that super quickly, but it's, as I said, it's very much there for you to go back to, and hopefully you now have the link. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. So the link to that document will be in the chat, I hope. I haven't got control over the chat, so hopefully Brogan or somebody else will put it there. That's great. We've got at least 20, 25, 30 minutes for questions and answers. I don't see any yet in the in my chat, so I'm going to start both speakers off with a question of my own. So Andrew, I find utility pricing really interesting. It makes an awful lot of sense to me. How disruptive will it be, you think, for a council to try this out, and this is worthwhile doing?
Right. Well, we don't know anyone who has done this, but we have created a model, an illustrative example for some local authority we were working with. And what we did is we created 4 or 5 charge matrices, if you like. So the matrix is time of entry, time of departure, and they were in blocks. So it's like a 5x5 matrix where we're putting in the standard times. And in each box, we came up with a notional charge that we felt should be applied for each of the things we looked at. And we looked at congestion, severance. Gosh, I'm trying to remember some of the other things we looked at. Let's just start with those two. Oh, and there was duration of stay, because this car park was deemed to be a car park that would be full between 10 and 4. So we also had a time of stay charge in there, because at that time that was relevant. Duration of stay was also a relevant charge. And when we applied all the costs together, because they basically accumulate and count and you add them together, when we did that, we ended up with charges that were not dissimilar to what people making those sorts of journeys were currently making. So someone who came in a weekday morning and went in the evening was being hit with the congestion charge, was also being hit by the duration of stay charge in the middle of the day. They were paying about £7 or £8. And somebody who was coming into the shops, coming into the town centre for 90 minutes, let's say, who is coming in at 10 o'clock and leaving at 11:30, 12, they weren't being hit by any of those charges, but they were being subject to the duration of stay charge and some severance charges, which notionally was causing them to pay £2 or £3 for their trip. So the thing about it was that, to answer your question about how disruptive this was, it could be introduced without the public feeling as though much had changed. They'd be paying pretty much what they already had, and it wouldn't feel untoward. The beauty of it would be is that once the mechanism in place and people understood what they were being charged for, if a local authority starts to ramp up the importance of its strategic objectives around the environment or whatever, then the environmental charges start to increase, and the mechanism is in place for that to happen. And so that kind of is the value behind utility charging, is that it starts to get a new mindset which aligns much better to the strategic objectives and arguably the challenges that we have in the future.
Yeah, what I actually like in that, and although I'm not quite sure whether well, we as transport planners get this, but whether everybody else gets it as well, in terms of linking the as it were, the value or the multiplier to what your strategic objectives are, whether they are dealing with congestion, whether they're dealing with environment, whether they're dealing, as you say, with severance. You can start changing that. I presume in the end, people will see the absolute value of what they pay, and hopefully that will then actually lead to the behavior change that we're looking for. Because as you were saying in the beginning, if people roughly pay what now, well, will pay the same as what they pay now, I don't expect any behavior change. And of course, that is one of the things that the document tries to set out, is we can achieve behavior change by using something as simple and available as parking policy.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add, Tom, I mean, one thing we don't mention in utility pricing, because it's a new line on this, is if within there are different regimes of charging because of the type of vehicle that people are operating, certainly towards larger and heavier vehicles and potentially the carbon they generate, then that could be linked in so much that, of course, charging now wouldn't change, but in due course, as the multipliers for those sorts of vehicles that may not be seen to be favourable for the environment increase, then it does start to cause people to make choices around what sort of vehicles they operate and own, arguably.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a question for Alice. There's some questions coming through in the chat, but I need to have time to actually read them. Obviously your examples, as you yourself said, are mainly from London. Most of the country is not like London. Most transport planners seem to live in London or other big cities. And for many others, access to public transport is poor, cycling facilities almost non-existent, and people feel that they're basically reliant on cars. So how relevant is parking policy for other parts of the country, and how does it need to differ from the kind of examples that you gave for a London context?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think for me it's about, if, assuming that there is a desire to shift away from car use, then parking is a very, very good place to start. So you're never going to be able to change anything if you don't want to, if you like. So, if we have a choice, I think we continue with car-based planning and urban fringe development, which is car dependent, where we have parking standards of 2 or 3 or 1.5 or 2, whatever it is. If we continue in that direction, it's going to be very hard to ever change anything. So I think fundamentally you have to actually want to change, obviously, but if you want to do that, then parking is a very, very good place to start, partly because you can start to control town centre car parking without necessarily controlling residential parking, and that will impact on a certain number of trips, and it will start to help to support bus services again, so, or cycling or whatever it is. So yes, you need the carrot and the stick, but you have to start somewhere. So that's why I kind of feel like parking is hugely relevant to every town, and certainly city centre, every town and city in the country, really. I mean, obviously in rural areas things are going to be different, but I think in towns which are the size of most British.
I think, Alice, we've just lost you.
Car-centered everything, it's not just new development. I think the other thing that I think, you know, the one thing we haven't mentioned is the people without cars, and I publish these stats quite often, not just for London, because obviously in London, in central London, in inner London, it's 2/3 of households are without a car, but in outer London it is still 1/3, and in most other parts of the country you're still looking at roughly 1/5. So that's going to be different, obviously, in lot, but you know, usually it's older people, younger people, and people on low incomes who are impacted by having no access to public transport. They can't get anywhere. So I think, you know, there's a huge social equity issue there as well.
Yes, social equity, of course, will need to come from the alternatives that are available rather than the car not being available, but the car being being made more difficult for people to come into town centers by cars. I'm glad to see I've got some questions coming through. I'm going to take Anthony Plum asking, can you say a little more about controlling non-residential private parking and why workplace parking levies have not been adopted by most local authorities? Andrew, maybe there's one for you.
With respect to workplace parking levies, I don't know why more haven't been adopted. It seems to be one of the mysteries, because Nottingham obviously pioneered it, and it's been a great success for them. I think they can demonstrate how it hasn't killed their economy. They can also show that it reduced the amount of parking spaces within the charged area by 25%, which was a great achievement of the objective, and it's funded helped fund their tram extensions. So it does seem, I don't know. It seems amazing to me that more cities have not done this.
Yep, fair enough answer, Andrew, and I'm with you on that myself. And maybe there are people online. Drop a note, say, well, I know reasons why, you know, my local authority has tried it and it failed, whether that was political or commercial or whatever. Alice, one for you from Ellie Savage. Have you experienced parking policy getting drawn into the culture wars, the war on the motorists, and how would you try to respond or avoid and deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's very firmly right in there. I mean, every councillor I've ever met has said, you won't get me talking about parking in the run up to an election, or pretty much ever. So yes, it is firmly in there. So I think it's just, you know, it's not something that I would ever expect a politician to go out on an election platform for, but it is something that I would, you know, say they can introduce. I mean, it's a really important part of what councils do. So there it is. It doesn't have to be political, but you can change things. You can. The other way that I try to talk about this is to talk about the positive. So actually, people really quite like areas which are not dominated by car parking. You know, there is a positive side to this, and all of those bits that I put in the presentation about public realm or urban realm, you know, you just look at them and they're so much nicer. I know John Burke, councillor, used to be a Hackney councillor, tweets about things a lot, and one of the things he said was, you know, we always go on holiday to these nice towns and cities in Europe where they have no parking in the town centre, and you know, why are they nice? Well, because they're not car parks. And so I think there's a lot to say. There's a lot positive to say. There's a huge amount that's positive now about things like managing rainwater, managing pollution with on-street rain gardens, and in introducing habitat within towns and cities, particularly where there's a massive grey, it's a very over grey towns or town centres, just to make them much nicer spaces to be. So yeah, I think focus on the positive, but also, yeah, just do it as part of your business and do it incrementally and do it bit by bit.
Okay, that leads me nicely on to, and I'm going to stay with you here, Alice, where to a question that Ash Kirkwood asked, and I think many people that are sort of against sort of removing parking. So after parking is removed for a bus lane or for other reasons, parklets and so on and so forth, where do cars get parked then? Is it just moving the problem away? And I think we said something about it. Andrew can come back on that as well in our document. But this will be, I think, a key issue to have to deal with. If you take away parking spaces now and people do not change the number of cars that they own, then in the end, the problem will be moved away. What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, I think you were the one who wrote the article on induced demand, which I'm going to go and read, but I think it's the opposite, isn't it? So if you take away, you do the opposite to inducing demand, you reduce demand. With main road parking, which might have been for loading, it is obviously important to make sure that businesses can still load. But there are two ways of dealing with that. One is to create loading bays on side streets. The other is to create loading bays which only operate outside of bus lane time scales. If it's for people to come and park and shop, then arguably you shouldn't be, allowing that, or you should be getting rid of it altogether, or you should be creating paid parking bays on side streets. So I've seen that happen as well. So hopefully that answers that question.
Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm just looking at the question about research. I'm sure there are bits and pieces around this, but off the top of my head, I'll give my view on this. I think two things happen. People do move the cars elsewhere in the short term. Maybe over the longer term, those people move elsewhere if they're really wedded to using their cars because it becomes inconvenient. So you have a self-selection as to who lives in those streets over time. And perhaps these are the people who go and buy themselves a suburban house with a large driveway. But I also think that there's an element of people find it less convenient. This is all a case of progressively making the attractiveness of walking out of my front door and there is the car and I can get in it and go to where I want to I've got to walk 5 or 6 minutes away to get it because I've had to park it somewhere else. And when I come back, I'm going to have to hunt for somewhere to park it. Starts to make using other modes more attractive. It's a bit coercive, but I think it has an impact in that those people who would own cars or may own 2 cars actually start to think about whether they need the second one. And it does drive behavioral change in time.
Yes, it is as many people comment also in the chat. It will be slowly catchy monkey kind of situation, and it is as you said in your first example, Andrew, also around recognizing that people can't change their behavior immediately, so providing alternatives to those car parking spaces in the short term without being committed to providing that forever, which leads me to sort of a very simple question, and then I'll go back into the chat to sort of read what everybody else has said. Is on-street plus surface car parking the real enemy? Or is it not as simple as that? I've just read that there are 3 to 8 parking spots per car in the US. I don't know what that number is in the UK. Andrew, you might know that. But looking at what Alice was showing, it's not just about parking cars. It's also taken up really valuable space, and you could deal with that by multi-story car parks. Andrew, can you?
Sorry, Tom, I missed the question.
Why did you miss it? Look, we have to say it all again now.
Well,
Basically, okay. In summary, are surface car parks and on-street car parking the real issue? Both actually in town centres, but also at people's homes at the beginning of the trip rather than at the end of the trip. Or is it how we solve it by multi-story car parks, or is it more fundamental?
Oh, okay. I think the issue of space is probably separate to going back to what the TPS were driving at in 2020 when they did the State of the Nation. That was about, if we are to create a sustainable future, we need to decarbonize transport. And the driver there was saying fundamentally people had to drive less. So I think if we keep that clear as the objective, which is we do need people to drive less, then whether it's a multi-story car park or a surface car park, the surface is the issue of the surface, and the things that Alice is showing us in there is how cars actually make other modes of transport potentially more difficult and make it harder to transition. But the fundamental is that we actually need people to drive less because of the carbon impacts.
And also the financial viability of public transport is made more difficult if you have a lot of space given to car parking, even if it's in multi-story.
And Chris Bure says yeah, he's absolutely right on that. Yeah, the design of car parks where private cars will be prioritized and coaches are further at the back or even off-site, and that in itself will as it were penalize that as an alternative mode. I'm sure there are other examples that you can come up with where this is happening as well. So yes, I do hear what you say, that cars and parked cars have an impact on the attractiveness of alternatives, and it could even be walking and actually being able to walk instead of taking the car. Let me see what else I've got. Jeremy,
I was just going to wonder about this. It's a really interesting question about controlled parking zones.
Okay, you can take any question you like, Alex.
Well, it's a really interesting point, which is that does creating a controlled parking zone confer kind of ownership of that space by private car owners? And I think that's a really interesting point, isn't it? And I don't think there's a really straightforward answer to this, but I definitely feel like it should be recognised. But I also kind of feel like, well, if you're allowing front garden parking, then you're allowing that space in front of that house is a driveway now, and that's all it can be used for forever. So there are kind of, swings and roundabouts, aren't there? But ultimately, if you control parking, obviously it makes it harder for people to make short car trips or a certain type of car trip. But I think that you have to be super careful about how you introduce controlled parking zones, and so that they don't have unwanted impacts. And one of those might be that you overcreate parking, residential parking, and that you don't allow space to be used for other things. So I think there's got to be a kind of sensible transition in there. And I think, if you're not in an area where controlling parking in residential areas is going to make a lot of difference, then the focus probably needs to be on destination parking.
Yeah, I like that. I like that thinking. I think there are two ends of a car trip, and maybe in some cases it's the destination end, that where your greatest ability is to change behavior, and particularly change the attractiveness of car as an alternative, and in other places it has to be the home end, the origin end. Particularly, I guess, in locations where parking is at a premium in dense urban areas, and where there are alternatives to taking the car. Andrew, have you got any thoughts on
that? Can I say no at this stage?
You can say no. Okay, in which case I'm going to take the next question, unless you were reading carefully about which question you wanted to pick out of the chat. rather than me desperately trying to do justice to all these questions that are coming through so quick and fast. Andrew Dorian, could you possibly say something about the impending challenge of available curbside space for EV charging, specifically for residential charging, and the rollout of the LEVI, low emission vehicle? I don't know what LEVI investment is, sorry. So how do you see us deal with that particular issue of increasing demand for EV charging and the impact on parking?
So I see the word challenge in there, and I think that there are a number of challenges which Andrew's no doubt recognizing or aware of. I mean, one of the big things I see about trying to introduce EV charging on street in the residential context is that you generate this potential of privilege. If you have a street where there's 10 houses and they're currently competing for 8 parking spots, let's say, with their cars, and then you say, well, one of those spots is going to be for electric charging, and of course only one of those residents has an electric car, they've effectively been granted this guaranteed parking spot for themselves. And from a social point of view, socioeconomic point of view, we can guess that the early adopters of the electric car are likely to be the better off, or those who've had it provided by their company. So there's a funny social equity thing here around that, and it's a big challenge. And I'm ignoring things about cables trailing across the road and how you manage it. So I don't have a stream of answers to this. I recognise that there's probably more challenges that, if Andrew's been dealing with this, he's probably aware of more than I am in terms of some of the political issues and the local community issues. To my mind, the focus perhaps needs to be on providing electric charging and supporting the adoption of electric vehicles with those who have their own off-street charging. And that probably should be the place where we focus efforts first. Some might disagree, I dare say.
Well, that's what we're here for, to disagree, I think, Andrew, because it's a thorny issue.
I think we have seen a new wave of front garden conversions because it's cheaper to charge electric vehicles, and that, from our point of view, that's disastrous environmentally, because you're trying to build rain gardens to take rainwater runoff, and yet more gardens are being converted. And even though they're supposed to have permeable surfacing, it doesn't actually. Usually after a few years, it's compacted or full of stuff, and so it doesn't. So unless surfacing is genuinely permeable, you're still creating a problem, and EV charging is going to add to that problem. So we are wondering if pavement gullies is one way to tackle that. But yeah, it's definitely a thorny problem, and we've certainly seen at least one borough in London make conversions of front gardens easier because of a wave of move to electric vehicles. Richmond, which has is quite a wealthy borough, so lots of people with EVs. It's obviously not such a massive issue where people don't have the money to buy them.
Yes, I've got some other thoughts about that, but let's have a look at some more questions. I think the Dan Friel and Jeremy Galilee, I think, pick up sort of the same kind of point around maximum parking standards. We all think as transport planners, they obviously make a lot of sense. In reality, they have caused quite a lot of problems in estates that were built with maximum parking standards, and cars being abandoned everywhere, including obviously on the pavement. And alternatively, as Jeremy is saying, will it actually lead to, rather than more opportunities for more sustainable alternative, is just basically squeezing more and denser housing into the same space because you don't provide parking spaces anymore. Andrew, how do you see that work itself out?
Yeah, I think absolutely right. I mean, the the 2000s with the PPG 13, you can almost go around the country now and spot those residential developments that were built under that regime. And I was party to working with Essex County Council years ago around asking residents what they thought about their new neighbourhoods when they moved in, and parking was one of the biggest and almost only point of conflict and disappointment they had about their new living standards. So agreed, it's a problem. I mean, it stems to some extent about our attitude and the community's attitude towards what somebody does with a car. If we have created maximum parking standards at the residential end, and people choose to own more vehicles than they have space to park them, then what we see is that people start putting them on the pavement and in other public space, and that is largely accepted or tolerated. And perhaps one of the moves needs to be is to change public attitude. And this isn't a quick fix by any means, but it goes back to some of the things we're talking about. If that was deemed to be unacceptable and addressed immediately and quickly and promptly, then people wouldn't do it. That's the first thing. And the second thing is linked to that. I think one of the adages I heard from a guy called Paul Barter, who lives out in South Singapore and writes quite a lot about these sorts of issues. He said that if you can control overspill, use maximums. If you can't, use minimums. And I thought it was quite a pragmatic bit of advice, really, in that respect. And so it goes back to me answering the question. We need, if we're going to do it, we need to control the overspill.
Yeah, I think that's I think there's been really interesting discussion around this, that there are always considerations that say, well, the one size fits all doesn't work, but there are alternative ways of thinking about it. And I think certainly, as you say, when is a minimum the right thing to do? When is a maximum the right thing to do? Do we aim at the home end or at the destination end? And everybody on the call, there is a lot about these kind of considerations in the report. So please pick that up. Which to some extent, I know there are more questions, but I do suggest we're aiming at an end. I haven't had lunch myself yet anyway, so I'm getting rather hungry. So the first thing I was going to say was, please, after this seminar, go and visit our TPS website, where these documents are available to you, and let us know if you are finding them useful and how you may be using them, or how you might want to add to the 18 recommendations that we've put in there. Let me thank Alice and Andrew for their presentations and answering your and my questions today. So if you can find that clapping hand thing somewhere on here, you can even give them a clap as well. Let me, come on guys, let me see those clapping hands. I don't see them, maybe. Then I want to thank Brogan McPherson for organizing this and for you attending. I hope you found it useful and interesting. And then finally, for those of you that are TPS members, on the 7th of March, we will hold our AGM online, 6 p.m. And at 7 p.m., Will Petley from Oxfordshire will give his Transport Planner of the Year lecture. And again, details are found on our website. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you for attending, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.